At my sister Bianca's wedding, she raised her champagne glass and pointed straight at my 8-year-old daughter. "Your fatherless child does not belong in the family photographs," she said. A few guests laughed because they thought she was joking. My mother did not. She leaned toward me and whispered that I should take Ivy home before I ruined Bianca's perfect day. Ivy stood beside me in her pale blue dress, one hand closed around the little silver rescuing pin she had worn for luck. I was about to tell my sister exactly what kind of woman humiliates a child at her own wedding when the windows began to shake. A helicopter swept over the lake and descended toward the resort's private landing pad. Bianca did not look surprised. She looked terrified. A man in a black suit stepped through the terrace doors minutes later. A faint scar crossed his temple, and several guests recognized him from the flood rescues that had been on national television. I recognized him for a different reason. Gideon Shaw was the man an old laboratory report had once proved could not be Ivy's father. He stopped when he saw the pin on my daughter's dress. "I gave that to your mother 9 years ago," he said quietly. Then he looked at Ivy, but he did not move closer. "My name is Gideon. I am here because a new test says you are my daughter." Bianca's glass slipped from her hand and shattered across the marble floor. Gideon turned toward her. "The first test was not wrong by accident. Someone changed it, and the person who did it is standing in this room. Stay with me to discover what my family had hidden for 8 years, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about betrayal, truth, and the courage to fight back." 48 hours earlier, I was standing in my workshop with a scraper in one hand, and Bianca's latest message glowing on my phone. "Ivy may attend, but she will not be included in the family photographs. She is not to ask questions about her father. You will both leave before my speech. Please do not make this difficult." Bianca had a gift for writing cruelty in the language of good manners. She could shut a child out of the family and still make it sound like a scheduling note. I set the phone face down beside the old walnut cabinet I had been restoring for nearly a week. Someone had covered it with 3 coats of white paint, hiding the grain and the hand-carved detail beneath. My work was patient and exact. I removed one layer at a time until I found what was original and what had been added later to disguise it. I owned a small furniture restoration shop outside Grand Rapids. It was not glamorous, but it was mine. I had built it while raising Ivy and learning not to wait for rescue. After being told 8 years earlier that Gideon Shaw was not my daughter's father, I stopped asking questions that might leave me hurt twice. Ivy came through the workshop door, carrying a garment bag almost as tall as she was. "Can I show you the dress again? You showed me last night. I want to make sure it still looks right in daylight." She unzipped the bag and revealed a pale blue dress with a satin ribbon. Ivy preferred model planes and anything with moving parts, but she had chosen that dress because she wanted to look like she belonged in the photographs. My stomach tightened when she laid a small silver pin beside it. 2 narrow wings curved around a rescue shield. Gideon had given it to me 9 years earlier, before everything between us collapsed. "I found it in the cedar box," she said. "Can I wear it for luck?" For years I had kept that box closed because it held a life I could not explain. My first instinct was to refuse. Then I remembered Bianca's message, telling my daughter what she could not wear, ask, or join. "Yes," I said. "You can wear it." Ivy studied my face. "Did it belong to my father?" "It belonged to someone I once cared about." That was not my question. Ivy already knew when adults place soft words over a hard truth. I told her there were things I was still trying to understand. She was not satisfied, but she knew I was not lying. 3 weeks earlier, Ivy's school had featured her class project, My Family Story, on the local evening news. She had built a small rescue helicopter from wood scraps and described our family as 2 people who repaired things together. I had stood beside her for less than a minute, proud and uncomfortable under the camera lights. 2 days later, a lawyer named Helen Cross called my shop. She said Elise Shaw had seen the segment and recognized me. More importantly, she had recognized Ivy's eyes, her age, and the little silver rescue wing pin displayed beside the model. Elisa was Gideon's older sister. Gideon did not call me directly. He asked the lawyer to explain that he wanted an independent paternity test and that I could choose the laboratory. No private samples, no envelopes sent from home. We went to separate collection sites, showed identification, signed every label, and watched each sample sealed in front of us. I agreed because I was tired of telling Ivy that some questions had no answers when the truth was that I had been afraid to look again. The result arrived that Thursday morning. Probability of paternity, greater than 99.99%. I read the number 6 times. Then I locked the workshop door, sat on the floor beside the walnut cabinet, and called Gideon through the lawyer's office. His voice was lower than I remembered. Mara, I know I have no right to ask you for anything. You have the right to explain, I said. That is all. He told me he was attending a rescue training program near the lakeshore that weekend. I told him Bianca's wedding was at the Lake Marlowe Resort on Saturday, and that Ivy would already be dealing with enough attention. We agreed he could meet her after the ceremony in a private room. I would remain present. He would not arrive before the wedding, approach her publicly, touch her without permission, or introduce himself as her father, as though 8 missing years could be erased by one laboratory report. Gideon accepted every condition without arguing. I did not tell Bianca or my mother. Before I allowed a man from my past into Ivy's future, I needed to see whether he respected boundaries when no one was applauding him. The next evening, Ivy and I arrived at the resort for the rehearsal dinner. Lake Marlowe was surrounded by pine trees, stone terraces, and enough white flowers to make the place look less like a wedding venue and more like Bianca's private kingdom. My mother, Colleen, studied me before I had taken off my coat. You seem distracted, she said. Nothing is wrong, is it? Nothing I cannot handle. Her gaze stayed on me a second too long. Then Bianca approached in an ivory rehearsal dress, smiling until she saw the pin on Ivy's blue dress. What is that? My lucky pin, Ivy said. Bianca reached toward it, but I stepped between them. The pin stays on her dress. It looks cheap, she said. The photographer is trying to create a consistent family image. It is a pin, Bianca, not a public scandal. Her smile tightened. You always have to challenge the smallest request. Before I could answer, the venue coordinator appeared near the ballroom doors with a phone pressed to her ear. Yes, Miss Keene. I need your approval, she said to Bianca. The bridge on the East Road will remain closed because of storm damage. The aircraft has permission to use our private landing pad, but it will arrive earlier than scheduled. Bianca frowned. What aircraft are you talking about? A helicopter registered for Gideon Shaw. The color drained from my sister's face. I felt the room tilt, though nothing around me had moved. Gideon had promised he would not appear before the wedding. There might have been a practical reason for the change, but Bianca's reaction was not confusion. It was recognition. She caught my mother by the arm and pulled her through the ballroom doors. I followed far enough to hear them, but stopped before they could see me. From the other side of the door, Bianca spoke in a harsh whisper. If Gideon sees that child, everything we did 8 years ago ends today. I stepped away from the ballroom door before Bianca or my mother could discover me listening. My first impulse was to walk in and demand an explanation, but Ivy was waiting 10 feet away with her coat over one arm. She deserved more than another argument conducted above her head. I took her back to our room and packed before I went to bed. Her suitcase stayed near the door. My truck was parked facing the exit, with the keys in the outside pocket of my purse. I had spent years believing that enduring my family calmly made me stronger. That night, I decided strength could also mean leaving the moment someone made my daughter pay for secrets she had never created. The next afternoon, we arrived at the resort 40 minutes before the ceremony. Ivy looked across the lake, at the rows of white chairs, and the flower arch standing beneath the pines. Are you sure Aunt Bianca wants us here? She invited us, I said. We are not going to hide because she has forgotten how to behave. I did not tell Ivy what I had overheard. I also did not tell her Gideon might arrive earlier than planned. One adult surprise was already too much. I wanted to understand what Bianca feared before it touched my child. A hostess checked our names, then handed me 2 place cards. Mine listed table 12, Ivy's listed table 19. Table 19 was not inside the ballroom. It was a narrow table near the service corridor, beside the door the catering staff used to carry trays from the kitchen. There must be a mistake, I told the hostess. Bianca appeared before the woman could answer, wearing her wedding gown and the polished smile she used whenever cruelty needed witnesses. Children have their own seating area, she said. I glanced down the hall. There were no other children at table 19. Then Ivy sits with me. Bianca's smile tightened. The chart has already been printed. Then the printer will survive, being ignored. I placed Ivy's card beside mine and led her toward the terrace where the family photographs were being organized. The photographer checked a clipboard and frowned. Marakin? Yes. I have the parents of the bride, the groom's family, and the bride's sister, but no child listed with you. I looked at Bianca. You removed Ivy. She was never part of the formal list, Bianca replied. We are trying to keep the photographs balanced. Ivy touched the silver rescue wing pin on her dress. Bianca noticed and turned to the photographer. Please make sure that pin does not appear in any candid shots. It is not part of the color palette. The photographer lowered his camera. He looked embarrassed, rather than obedient. The pin stays, I said. And if Ivy is not welcome in the family photographs, neither am I. My mother approached before Bianca could answer. Colleen rarely raised her voice. She had spent years turning quiet disappointment into a weapon. Mara, your sister has allowed both of you to attend. Despite everything, she said. A little gratitude would not hurt. Despite what? Her eyes moved toward Ivy, then away. You know what I mean. No, I want you to say it clearly. Colleen's mouth pressed into a thin line. I kept my voice level. Ivy is not a favor Bianca granted me. She is a guest whose name is on the invitation. You do not get to humiliate her and call my silence gratitude. For once, my mother had no soft answer ready. A venue coordinator hurried onto the terrace with a radio in her hand. She whispered to Bianca, but I was close enough to hear. The helicopter is 30 minutes ahead of the revised arrival time. The pilot is requesting final clearance now. Bianca looked toward the landing pad beyond the lake. Her face changed in the same way it had the night before. Get security, she said. The coordinator hesitated. Is there a safety problem? Bianca pointed toward Ivy. That child is not following the event rules. She is wearing an unapproved metal accessory, and she is disrupting the photography schedule. Have them escort her and her mother to the lobby until the ceremony begins. A security officer approached with the resort manager. The manager checked the electronic guest list on a tablet, then looked at Bianca. Mara Keene and Ivy Keene are both registered guests. The pin does not violate any property rule, and they have not disrupted the event. I am the bride, Bianca said. And this is still a licensed resort, the manager replied. I cannot invent a violation to remove an invited child. Several nearby guests had begun watching. Bianca noticed, and her anger disappeared beneath another smile. Of course, she said. There has simply been a misunderstanding. I knew my sister well enough to understand that the smile meant she had not surrendered. She had only changed methods. The cocktail hour began before the ceremony, so the photographer could finish the family portraits. Servers moved across the terrace with champagne, while a string quartet played near the open doors. Ivy stayed close to me, no longer asking where she should stand. When the photographer called for the bride's immediate family, I did not move. Bianca lifted a glass from a passing tray. Mara, she called loudly. Since you insist on making this an issue, perhaps we should explain it to everyone. The conversations around us faded. She raised the glass and pointed directly at Ivy. Your fatherless child does not belong in the family photographs. A few guests laughed. It was the uncertain laughter people use when they hope an ugly remark must be a joke. Bianca smiled, as if their reaction had proved her right. Then they saw Ivy's face. The laughter stopped. Ivy's hand closed around the rescue wing pin. Her skin had gone pale beneath the soft afternoon light. She looked up at me. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" The question hurt more than Bianca's words. Ivy was still young enough to believe adults rejected children for a reason. I crouched beside her and held both her hands. "No," I said. "You did nothing wrong. Your aunt did." Bianca gave a sharp laugh. "Do not turn this into one of your speeches. Everyone here knows there has never been a father." I stood and faced her. Not knowing who stood beside us does not give you the right to decide who belongs. Before she could answer, a deep vibration rolled across the lake. The glasses on the nearest table trembled. The string quartet stopped playing as a helicopter descended beyond the trees, its rotors scattering leaves across the private landing area. Most of the guests looked surprised. Bianca did not. She stared toward the aircraft with the expression of someone watching a locked door swing open. My mother reached for her arm, but Bianca pulled away. The helicopter landed. Minutes later, the terrace doors opened, and Gideon Shaw walked inside wearing a black suit. A faint scar crossed his temple. Two guests near the bar whispered his name, recognizing him from the televised flood rescue the previous spring. Gideon did not acknowledge them. He did not call for security, silence the room, or use his reputation to command anyone. His attention went first to me, then to Ivy. "I came to meet my daughter," he said. I moved in front of Ivy before he could take another step. A new test does not give you the right to walk into her life and claim her in front of strangers. His expression tightened, but he stopped immediately. "You are right," he said. "I should not have arrived before we agreed. The road closure changed the flight schedule, but I should have warned you sooner." He stepped back and kept his hands at his sides. "I will not approach her, unless you allow it." His restraint mattered, but it did not erase 8 years. I stayed between him and Ivy. Behind me, Bianca said, "This is absurd. Anyone can purchase a laboratory report." Gideon turned toward her slowly. "No," he said, "but someone with access to the original sample system could interfere with one." Bianca's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered across the stone floor. Gideon took a folded document from inside his jacket. He did not hand it to Ivy. He placed it in my hands. The independent laboratory compared the new chain of custody with the archived record from 8 years ago, he said. The first report was not wrong by accident. I looked down at the page, but the letters blurred for a moment. Gideon pointed to a line near the bottom. "The user code that changed the sample label begins with the letters B and K." The initials on the report seemed to burn through the page. B and K. The same initials as Bianca Keene. Whispers moved across the terrace, but the room had narrowed to Ivy's hand gripping the back of my dress. Gideon had arrived with answers. Bianca was staring at him as though he had dragged a body into her wedding, and my daughter had become the center of a spectacle she never asked for. I folded the document before anyone else could read it. "This conversation is not happening here," I said. A woman in a dark green dress stepped forward from behind Gideon. She had his gray eyes and the same careful way of keeping her distance. "I'm Elise Shaw, Gideon's sister. There is a private sitting room beside the bridal suite. I checked with the resort manager." I looked at Gideon. "You stay where I can see you. You do not touch Ivy unless she reaches for you first, and you do not call yourself her father as though a test has already built a relationship." "I understand," he said. I took Ivy's hand and followed Elise inside. Gideon walked several steps behind us. The sitting room overlooked the lake, but the heavy curtains softened the noise outside. Elise brought Ivy water, then sat near the door rather than joining us on the couch. Gideon remained standing until I told him he could take the chair across from us. Ivy studied him with the concentration she usually gave an unfamiliar piece of machinery. "I have seen you before," she said. Gideon glanced at me and asked whether she meant the news. She shook her head. "There was an old picture in Mom's tool chest. You were standing beside a red helicopter, and Mom was laughing." I had forgotten the photograph was still there. Years earlier, I had hidden it beneath instruction manuals and spare hinges because I could not throw it away. Gideon's expression changed. For a moment, the well-known rescue commander disappeared, and I saw the younger man who had once taught me how to identify aircraft by sound. "That was taken in Montana," he said. "Your mother repaired the wooden instrument case our crew used." Ivy looked from him to me. "If you knew Mom before I was born, why didn't you find me?" There was no gentle answer. Gideon leaned forward, then remembered my condition and stopped himself. "I was told I was not your father," he said. "A laboratory report said it, and I believed it. Later, I received a letter with your mother's name on it, telling me not to contact either of you." "I never wrote that letter," I said. "I know that now." Anger rose so quickly that my hands shook. "You believed one report and one letter, and that was enough for you?" Gideon said it was not the only reason. He had also come to my mother's house 4 days after the report. The answer stopped me. "What happened when you went there?" "Colleen opened the door. She said you refused to see me, that the baby belonged to someone else, and that your family would seek a restraining order if I returned." My mother had told me Gideon never came. She had sat beside me while I cried, and said a man who truly loved me would have fought to explain himself. "You could have asked for another test," I said. "You fly into storms when strangers need you, but you accepted one locked door when it was us." Gideon did not defend himself. "You are right, Mara." His answer made me angrier because I had prepared for excuses. "I was 29, humiliated, and certain you had lied to me," he continued. "I let pride and a report make the decision I should have questioned. I thought leaving you alone was respecting your choice. It was also easier than risking another rejection. That failure belongs to me, no matter who interfered." Ivy watched him carefully. "Are you apologizing to us?" "Yes. And your mother does not owe me forgiveness." The simplicity of his answer eased something in Ivy's shoulders, but not in mine. Trust could not be created by a man admitting he had failed. It could only begin there. The door opened without a knock. Bianca entered with my mother behind her, and Miles a few steps away. My sister had replaced her shattered glass with a flawless smile, but her breathing was uneven. "This has gone far enough," she said. "The ceremony is waiting, and a famous man has turned my wedding into a publicity stunt." Gideon rose and said he had not invited the press. "You did not have to," Bianca replied. "People already have their phones out. A celebrated rescue pilot appears in a black suit, claims a child before a crowd, and suddenly everyone forgets the bride." "This is not about your wedding," I said. Bianca ignored me and looked at Ivy. "You should not believe everything an adult says just because he arrives in a helicopter." I stood between them. "You will not address her again." Bianca turned back to Gideon. "How convenient that your new test says exactly what you need it to say. Men with your money can purchase a laboratory, a lawyer, and a touching reunion story." Miles had been silent until then. He looked at Bianca with growing unease. "How do you know so much about the old test?" he asked. Bianca claimed she did not know what he meant, but Miles reminded her that she had called the original report definitive before anyone explained how it had been processed. "I worked at the laboratory," she said. "Of course I understand the system." "You worked in sample intake during the same period my test was handled," I said. Bianca's eyes hardened. "That proves nothing." "No one said it did," Miles replied. "But you are responding to details no one gave you." My mother placed a hand on his arm. "Miles, this is a painful family misunderstanding. Let Bianca finish the ceremony, and we can discuss it tomorrow." He moved away from her touch. A child was publicly humiliated, and now there may be evidence connected to Bianca's former workplace. We are not proceeding as though nothing happened. Bianca stared at him. "You are postponing our wedding because Mara created another crisis?" "I am pausing the program until Ivy is safely away from the guests, and I understand why my bride appears frightened by a laboratory record." He stepped into the hall, and asked the coordinator to keep the ceremony on hold. Bianca's face went rigid. For the first time that day, she could not control the room with a seating chart, a photographer, or a smile. Ivy touched the silver pin on her dress, and Gideon noticed. "May I see that?" he asked. I looked at Ivy. She considered him, then unclipped the pin and held it in her palm without offering it. Gideon stayed in his chair. "The left wing has a small scratch on the back. It curves like the letter J. I dropped it against a toolbox the night I gave it to your mother." Ivy turned the pin over. Elise switched on the lamp, and a thin curved mark appeared in the silver. I remembered the storm warning that night, and Gideon searching the hangar floor until he found the pin beneath my workbench. He had apologized for damaging it. I had told him repaired things often meant more than perfect ones. Ivy fastened it back onto her dress. "You really did give it to her?" "Yes, I did," Gideon said, without asking her to hand it over. I opened the independent report once more. Beneath the paternity result was a note I had not fully read on the terrace. The laboratory had compared its chain of custody data with the archived transaction history from the original test. One sample label had been reprinted outside the normal workflow. The user identification was partly masked under privacy rules, but the visible letters matched Bianca's initials. The access time fell during the overnight shift she had worked at the laboratory 8 years earlier. Bianca looked over my shoulder. "That could belong to anyone." "Then explain why you are afraid of it," I said. Before she could answer, Gideon's phone rang. He checked the screen and said Dr. Naomi Price, who had supervised archive compliance at the laboratory, was calling. He answered and placed the call on speaker. Naomi did not waste time on greetings. "I remember this file," she said. "The sample code wasn't altered by a machine error. Someone reprinted it at 2:13 a.m. Naomi asked Gideon to switch the call to video so she could show us the archived record. While he set his phone against a lamp, I asked Elise to take Ivy into the enclosed garden beside the sitting room. Ivy searched my face before agreeing. "I will be right here," I told her. Elise promised they would not leave the glass doors. Gideon did not object or ask for more time with Ivy. He watched her go, then turned back to the screen. Naomi's words about the label being reprinted at 2:13 inches the morning pulled me into a memory I had spent 8 years trying not to touch. I had been 7 months pregnant when Gideon received an assignment to help establish a long-term rescue training program in Alaska. It would begin before Ivy was born and last most of a year. His organization had approved family housing, and we planned for me and the baby to join him after I recovered from the delivery. We were not married, but we had chosen a name, compared cribs, and argued gently about whether a child needed a mobile shaped like clouds or airplanes. Gideon had cleared one shelf in his apartment for my woodworking books. I had begun telling customers that I might relocate after the winter. My mother treated the plan as a betrayal. "Alaska is not a place to raise a newborn without family," Colleen said one evening at her kitchen table. "His work sends him into storms. What happens when you are alone up there? I will have Gideon, and we can come home to visit." "You say that now." Bianca sat beside her, still wearing the navy scrubs from her overnight shift at the laboratory. She let our mother press until Gideon finally said he was not taking me anywhere I did not want to go. Colleen looked at my stomach. "Before anyone moves across the country, everyone should be certain." The insult was clear. Gideon told her he had never questioned that the baby was his. I should have ended the conversation there, but I wanted one document strong enough to stop my mother from planting doubt in every future decision. Bianca offered the solution. "Let me arrange a quick test before Gideon leaves," she said. "Then no one can raise this again. It will also make the legal paperwork easier while he is out of state." She explained that the laboratory could use a blood sample from me and a cheek swab from Gideon. She knew the intake system, the forms, and the collection schedule. She said she could make sure nothing was delayed. I trusted her because she was my sister, and because she spoke with the confidence of someone who understood rules better than I did. Bianca scheduled us near the end of one of her night shifts. A technician collected the samples while Bianca handled the labels and carried the sealed package toward intake. She smiled and told me the result would finally give our mother nothing left to argue about. 4 days later, the report excluded Gideon as the father. He was already at the training site when the laboratory released it. We spoke by phone because neither of us could wait until he returned. Was there someone else? He asked. The question broke something in me. You told my mother you never doubted me. I did not, but this is a certified report. So the paper knows me better than you do? He went silent, and I heard the distance between us become larger than Alaska. I built my plans around a child I believed was mine, he said. And now you think I trapped you. I did not say that. You did not have to. He said my name, but I was too hurt to hear anything except accusation. I told him not to call again if a laboratory result mattered more than everything he knew about me. He replied that perhaps leaving me alone was the only decent thing he could still do. That was the last conversation we had before Ivy was born. In the sitting room, Gideon lowered his eyes. I should have come home immediately, he said. I should have stood in front of you instead of trying to understand it through a telephone. You did come home, I replied. You went to my mother's house. He nodded. A few days after our call, he had taken emergency leave and driven there. Colleen met him at the door. She said I refused to see him, the baby belonged to someone else, and a lawyer would request a restraining order if he returned. I had been upstairs in my old bedroom that afternoon, sick from stress and packing for an apartment across town. My mother had told me the knock at the door was a delivery. Gideon opened a leather folder and removed an envelope protected inside a clear sleeve. There was one more thing, he said. 6 months after Ivy was born, he had written asking for a second test. The letter said he would pay for an independent laboratory and follow any conditions I set. It was addressed to me at Colleen's house because that was the last address he had. The envelope had been returned with a printed label stating that the recipient had moved and left no forwarding address. I never saw this, I said. I believed you had returned it. I studied the label. The words were ordinary, but a small line beneath them carried an account code and the name of the printer system. Grace Fellowship Administrative Office. My mother had managed the church books there for 12 years. Their office printed mailing labels for donation letters, holiday cards, and returned correspondence. I had helped her replace the label rolls often enough to recognize the narrow gray border. This did not come from the post office, I said. It was printed where my mother worked. Colleen's hand tightened around the strap of her purse. Bianca stepped in front of her. That still has nothing to do with the laboratory. Naomi's face appeared clearly on Gideon's screen. Behind her were several file boxes and a desk lamp. She told us she would explain the record without technical language. Every sample received a unique code. Gideon's original code should have followed his swab from collection through testing. At 2:13 that morning, Bianca's user account printed a second label. That new label carried the code of a different stored sample already known to produce an exclusion. The replacement code was then attached to Gideon's record. The machine tested a real sample, Naomi said. That is why the report looked legitimate. It simply was not his sample. Miles stared at Bianca. You changed the identity attached to it. No, she said quickly. Someone may have used my account. Naomi remained calm. Printing the label required the account password. Entering the cold storage room required Bianca's employee badge. The system recorded both within the same 2-minute period. Bianca said an employee could have borrowed her badge. Naomi replied that lending it would itself have required Bianca's participation, and no loss report had ever been filed. Miles moved away from her, as though the space between them had become unsafe. You are the compliance director for an entire laboratory network, he said. You have spent years telling me that records protect people from lies. Bianca lifted her chin. That is exactly why I know old records can be misunderstood. No, Miles said. It means you knew exactly how to make one appear trustworthy. I looked at Gideon. We had both been manipulated, but that did not erase the choices we made afterward. You sent one letter and came to one door, I said. Then you let 8 years pass. His face tightened. Yes. He did not hide behind the false report or my mother. I thought I was respecting what you wanted, he said. The truth is that I was ashamed, angry, and afraid of being rejected again. I accepted the answer that allowed me to stop asking. I was wrong. The regret in his voice could not return Ivy's first steps, her first day of school, or every night she asked a question I could not answer. It could only tell me that he understood those years had also been shaped by his surrender. Naomi read the access time once more and confirmed the badge number assigned to Bianca. Across the room, Colleen lowered herself into a chair. Her face had gone gray. Bianca did not think of this herself, she said very softly. I told her she had to do it. My mother did not look at me after admitting the idea had been hers. She sat with both hands wrapped around her purse, as though the room had become dangerous and that small leather bag was the only thing she could still control. Bianca turned on her immediately. Why would you say that now? Colleen lifted her head. Because Naomi has the access record. There is no point pretending you acted alone. The words were not an apology. They were an attempt to divide the blame before anyone could decide where it belonged. I asked my mother what she had told Bianca 8 years earlier. Colleen drew a slow breath and said that after my father died, the house had become unbearably quiet. Bianca was already building a career and talking about moving closer to the city. Then I became pregnant and planned to leave Michigan with Gideon. You were taking my only grandchild thousands of miles away, she said. You expected me to smile while you followed a man whose job could kill him any day. Gideon was not taking me anywhere. I chose to go. You were in love. People in love confuse hope with a plan. She spoke as if 8 stolen years had been the unfortunate result of her better judgment. She said Gideon's rescue work sent him into storms, fires, and flooded towns. In her mind, Ivy would eventually lose her father, and I would return home broken, carrying a child who had already learned what abandonment felt like. So you decided she should never know him at all, I said. I decided you needed stability. You created the loss you claimed you were protecting us from, then spent 8 years expecting me to be grateful. Her face tightened, but she did not cry. I kept you close to people who would always be here. I thought of every birthday Gideon had missed, every school form where I left the father's information blank, and every quiet question Ivy stopped asking because she saw what it did to me. You were here, I said, but you were standing on top of the truth. Colleen looked toward the garden doors, where Ivy sat with Elise beneath a white arbor. I did not know it would go this far. You asked Bianca to falsify a paternity test. How far did you think a lie like that would go? Bianca stepped forward before my mother could answer. I was 26. Dad had just died. Mom could barely function, and you were leaving. She would not stop talking about being alone. You worked in a laboratory, I said. You knew exactly what a sample label meant. She pressured me. She did not type your password. She did not use your badge. She did not walk into cold storage and put another man's code on Gideon's sample. Bianca's eyes filled, but I had watched her produce tears whenever consequences came too close. You have always made me responsible for keeping this family together. No one made you turn a medical record into a weapon. Miles stood near the door, his wedding jacket still buttoned, though the ceremony had now been delayed long enough that the musicians had stopped playing. He looked at Bianca, without moving toward her. Did you know the result was false when Mara gave birth? He asked. Bianca wiped beneath one eye. I was trying to survive our mother. That was not my question. She did not answer. Gideon removed another document from his folder. Unlike the laboratory report, this one carried the letterhead of a local law office. He handed it to me and said Colleen's attorney had sent it several weeks after he came to the house. The statement declared that I denied Gideon had any parental connection to my child and wanted all contact to end. It warned that further attempts to reach me could be treated as harassment. Attached to it was the false exclusion report. At the bottom was Gideon's signature, I stared at it longer than I had stared at the laboratory result. You signed this? Yes. The page stated that he would not continue seeking recognition, testing, or parental rights unless I contacted him first. You gave up in writing. Gideon did not tell me that he had been deceived. He did not point at my mother or Bianca. I was ashamed, he said. I believed you had lied about the pregnancy, then rejected my request to speak. Signing that paper allowed me to call my pride respect. I told myself I was honoring your wishes when I was protecting myself from hearing no again. His honesty did not soften the fact that he had put his name beneath the end of our child's claim to him. Ivy lost 8 years because they lied, I said, looking at Colleen and Bianca. Then I faced Gideon. She also lost them because you accepted their lie when fighting it became painful. I know. You cannot repair that by arriving in a black suit and telling a room full of strangers she is yours. I know that too. He said it without asking me to comfort him, which was the first useful thing he could offer. Through the glass doors, Ivy was turning the silver pin between her fingers. Elise sat beside her, keeping her voice low. I opened the door far enough to hear Ivy ask whether grown-ups could make a piece of paper tell a lie. Elise considered the question before answering. People can put false words on paper, and they can attach the wrong name to something true. That does not change what really happened. It only makes the truth harder to find. Can it always be found? Not always, Elise said. But this time, it was. I closed the door gently. Ivy did not need to hear adults assign percentages of blame, while her whole history changed on the other side of the glass. Naomi was still reviewing the archive logs on Gideon's phone. She asked us to wait while she searched every access event connected to the original case number. Several minutes passed before her expression changed. This file was opened again 6 years after the first test, she said. Gideon looked up. I made another request around that time. He explained that after surviving a rescue helicopter crash, he had begun reviewing the decisions he regretted most. He hired a different attorney, who sent the laboratory a formal request asking whether the stored sample could be retested using modern procedures. Naomi shared a record showing that the request had been scanned into the system. The next morning, someone opened the case through Bianca's account. What happened to the request? Miles asked. It was deleted before a compliance reviewer saw it, Naomi replied. Bianca folded her arms. Old requests were removed all the time if they lacked authorization. Naomi shook her head. This one included Gideon's identification, his signed consent, and a court-ready request for preservation. It should have triggered a review. She enlarged the log. The deletion time, account name, and badge confirmation were all visible. 6 years after the night my mother claimed Bianca had been frightened and pressured, my sister had been living in her own apartment, managing a laboratory team and making decisions without Colleen beside her. Gideon had offered her a chance to correct what she had done, without confessing publicly. She had erased it. Bianca looked toward the ballroom. I need a moment before I say anything else. She left through the adjoining bridal suite. Miles waited several seconds, then followed her. Naomi continued explaining that deleted audit entries were never completely gone. The system preserved a secondary record for legal compliance, though accessing it required administrative permission. She said she would contact the laboratory's general counsel immediately. A door opened sharply in the next room. Miles called my name, and the fear in his voice sent me across the sitting room. When I reached the bridal suite, Bianca was seated at a laptop with her employee credentials entered into the laboratory system. On the screen was a file labeled Ivy Keene and a button reading, Delete Archived Audit Entry. Miles crossed the bridal suite before Bianca could click the button. He closed the laptop with one hand and pulled it away from her. What were you about to delete? Bianca rose so quickly that the chair struck the vanity behind her. I was not deleting anything. I was protecting confidential patient information from being displayed in a room full of people. Miles kept his hand on the laptop. I saw Ivy's name. I also saw an archived audit entry connected to Gideon's request for another test. You do not understand how laboratory systems work. I understand what a delete button means. Bianca glanced toward the door and realized I was standing there with Gideon behind me. The fear on her face lasted only a second before she replaced it with anger. "This is exactly why unauthorized people should not be allowed near medical records," she said. "Gideon brought private information into my wedding. Naomi opened files over a video call. And now everyone is treating me like a criminal because I tried to stop a breach. I stepped into the room. You logged into the system yourself. Because someone had to protect the laboratory." "From what, Bianca? The record of what you did?" Her mouth tightened. Naomi's voice came from Gideon's phone in the sitting room. She had heard enough to understand what was happening. "Do not let her touch the computer again," she said. Naomi contacted the laboratory's data security department while Miles carried the laptop into the sitting room and placed it on a table. Bianca followed him, insisting that the device belonged to her and contained confidential information. Within minutes, the system rejected every attempt to reopen the file. Naomi explained that Bianca's account had been suspended. The original paternity case, the deleted retesting request, and every access log connected to them had been placed under legal preservation. No employee could alter or remove anything without creating another permanent record. Bianca stared at the locked screen. The calm mask she had worn all afternoon finally broke. She turned toward my mother first. "This is your fault. You were the one who said Mara would disappear if Gideon took her away." Colleen recoiled. "I never told you to keep changing records years later. You told me the family would fall apart unless I fixed it." Then Bianca looked at Gideon. "And you had 8 years to come back. Do not stand there pretending you were robbed of every choice. You signed the paper and walked away." Gideon did not answer. He had already admitted that part. Bianca faced me last. "If you had left the past alone, Ivy would never have known any of this. She would have gone home tonight, exactly as she arrived. No investigation, no strangers discussing her DNA, and no wedding destroyed." The accusation was so familiar that for a moment I could hear my mother's voice inside it. Every wound in our family had always belonged to the person who exposed it, never to the person who caused it. "Ivy was hurt 8 years ago," I said. "She was hurt when you decided she did not deserve to know her father. She was hurt every time you watched her ask questions and chose to protect yourself." Bianca shook her head. "She was a baby. She did not know what she was missing. That does not make stealing it harmless." I pointed toward the garden doors. "She was also hurt today when you called her fatherless in front of a room full of people. The truth being discovered did not create the consequences. Your choices did." Miles stood beside the closed laptop, his face pale beneath the ballroom lights. Bianca moved toward him. "We can still finish the ceremony. The guests are waiting, the officiant is here, and none of this has anything to do with our marriage." Miles looked at her for a long time. "This has everything to do with our marriage." She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. "You told me your work was built on protecting the integrity of records. You made me believe honesty was the one thing you would never compromise. I made a terrible decision when I was young. You tried to delete the evidence 10 minutes ago." Bianca opened her mouth, but he continued. "If you can erase the record of a child to protect yourself, what am I supposed to trust in our marriage?" She glanced toward the terrace, where the guests could be seen gathering near the glass doors. "They will think you abandoned me at the altar. I am not making a decision because Gideon is famous or because people are watching. I am making it because I saw what you were willing to do when you thought no one could stop you." Bianca told him they could discuss it after the vows. Miles refused. He asked the coordinator to announce that the ceremony had been postponed. He also told the officiant that he would not sign or complete the marriage license until the investigation established what had happened. Bianca stared at him as though postponing the ceremony were a greater betrayal than falsifying a child's history. My mother caught my arm as I turned toward the garden. "Mara, we can settle this privately." I removed her hand. "You already settled it privately 8 years ago. Think about what an investigation will do to Bianca's career." "I am thinking about what Bianca's career allowed her to do to Ivy." Colleen lowered her voice. "Gideon has lawyers, money, and reporters who follow everything he does. Once this becomes public, none of us will be able to control the story. That is why I will not use his lawyers." Gideon looked at me, but did not interrupt. I called an attorney named Rebecca Sloan, whose office had once handled a contract dispute for my restoration shop. I told her I needed independent representation involving falsified laboratory records and my daughter's identity. I also told her Gideon Shaw was involved but would not be directing my case or paying my legal fees. Rebecca asked me to preserve every document, avoid signing anything, and send photographs of the locked screen if the resort manager approved. She would contact the laboratory's legal department that evening. When I ended the call, Gideon asked whether Ivy and I wanted to leave through the private landing area. "The local press may already be outside," he said. "The helicopter could take you home without using the main entrance." 8 years earlier, other people had decided where I would live, who I would trust, and what truth I was allowed to know. I would not leave my sister's wedding as cargo in Gideon's aircraft, no matter how practical his offer sounded. "I brought my own truck," I said. "Ivy and I will leave the same way we came." He accepted my answer without arguing. Elise brought Ivy back inside. My daughter had heard that the ceremony was postponed, but no one had told her why. She still wore the pale blue dress and silver pin. A small white flower crown rested in her hands. Bianca saw her and forced her voice into something almost gentle. "You can keep that, Ivy. It was made for the photographs." Ivy walked across the room and placed the flower crown on the table beside the closed laptop. "I do not want to be in a picture where I have to pretend I do not exist." Bianca's face changed, but Ivy had already turned away. I took my daughter's hand, collected our coats, and led her through the main lobby. I did not hide behind Gideon, wait for Bianca's permission, or allow my mother to follow us. A few guests stared, but I kept walking. Outside, I helped Ivy into the truck and fastened her seatbelt. Gideon remained near the entrance instead of approaching us. He raised one hand in a quiet goodbye, then let me drive away. My phone rang before we reached the highway. It was Rebecca. "The laboratory has preserved the audit trail," she said. "But Naomi found one more document in Ivy's archived file." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "What kind of document?" "A request submitted under your name." Rebecca asked me to pull over before she explained the document. I parked beneath the yellow lights of a closed garden center, while Ivy watched me from the passenger seat. "The request was submitted shortly after Gideon asked for the original sample to be retested," Rebecca said. "It authorizes the laboratory to destroy the remaining material." "Whose name is on it?" "Yours." I knew the answer before she said it, but hearing it made my chest tighten. Rebecca sent a copy to my phone. The form carried my full name, an old address, and a signature that looked close enough to fool someone who had never watched me write. The first letter of my name had the same long curve I used. The final stroke rose in the right direction. Even the spacing between my first and last names had been copied. But the rhythm was wrong. Years of restoring furniture had taught me to notice the difference between age and imitation. A genuine tool mark carried the pressure and hesitation of the hand that made it. A copied mark concentrated on appearance, often missing the natural movement beneath it. My real signature began firmly and became lighter near the end. The signature on the form did the opposite. It started carefully, as though the writer were drawing each letter, then pressed harder when confidence took over. "I did not sign this," I said. Rebecca warned me not to describe myself as a handwriting expert. My observations mattered, but a qualified examiner would need to make the formal determination. "I am not trying to prove it alone," I replied. "I am telling you I know my own hand." She agreed and said Naomi had already preserved the original digital scan, the upload time, and the employee account that accepted it. The form had been filed the morning after Gideon's request for retesting entered the system. If the stored sample had been destroyed, Naomi explained, proving that Gideon's original label had been replaced would have become far more difficult. Bianca had not merely hidden his second request, she had tried to remove the physical evidence that could expose what she had done. I looked at Ivy. She could tell from my face that the call concerned her, but she did not ask me to explain while I was driving. I told her Rebecca had found another document that required my attention. "Is it another paper that lied?" she asked. "Yes. Can we go home now?" I promised we would, but Rebecca needed me to return briefly to the resort. She was requesting an emergency preservation order that would protect every record connected to Ivy and prevent Bianca from entering the laboratory system while the matter was reviewed. I called Elise and asked whether she could sit with Ivy in the resort manager's office. Gideon offered to stay away, unless Ivy requested him. That was the first arrangement he suggested that did not place himself at the center. When we returned, the white chairs were still facing the flower arch, but the guests had been moved into the ballroom for refreshments. Bianca had changed from her veil into a shorter reception dress. She moved between tables telling people there had been a private family emergency and that the ceremony might still continue. She had not surrendered the wedding. She was trying to polish it back into existence. Miles stood alone near the windows. His tie was gone, and his marriage license remained unsigned inside the officiant's folder. Rebecca joined us by video call. She showed me the destruction authorization and asked me to confirm that I had never requested the disposal of any sample. "I did not know a stored sample still existed," I said. "I never received Gideon's retesting request, and I never signed this form." Bianca approached while I was speaking. "You are treating a family conflict like organized crime. This stopped being a private conflict when you altered a laboratory record. I made one mistake when I was young. A mistake ends when someone has the chance to correct it." My voice remained calm, but every word felt clearer than the one before it. "You had another chance 6 years later. You deleted Gideon's request. You had another chance today, and you tried to erase the audit trail. You did not make one mistake, Bianca. You kept choosing the lie." Several guests nearby heard me. Bianca glanced toward them, and I saw the familiar instinct to control the audience. She lowered her voice. "You are going to destroy my career because you cannot let go of the past. You used your career to change my daughter's past." A man in a dark jacket entered the ballroom and asked for Bianca Keene. He was a licensed process server carrying papers issued under an emergency order signed by the county duty judge. He handed Bianca the documents in front of Miles, the resort manager, and the officiant. The order required the laboratory to preserve every physical and digital record linked to the case. It prohibited Bianca from accessing, modifying, or directing anyone else to alter those records while the investigation continued. Bianca stared at the pages. "You had me served at my wedding." "I asked the court to protect evidence," I said. "You chose the location by trying to delete it here." Miles walked to the officiant and requested the marriage license. He looked at it for several seconds, then returned it unsigned. "There will be no ceremony," he announced. Bianca caught his sleeve. "We can still leave tonight and deal with this privately." He removed her hand without humiliating her or raising his voice. "I watched you try to erase evidence involving a child. I will give the investigators an honest statement, but I will not marry you." He left through the main entrance alone. He did not ask Gideon to arrange transportation or use his name to punish Bianca. He simply refused to attach his life to what he had witnessed. My mother followed me into the corridor. "Please do not let Bianca lose everything over this," she said. "She spent years building that career." I turned toward her. Where was this concern when Ivy lost 8 years with her father? Colleen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "You are asking me to protect Bianca from consequences," I continued. "You never protected Ivy from the choice you helped make." She looked down at the carpet. For the first time, she had no explanation disguised as love. Before we left, Gideon asked whether he could give Ivy a letter. "No gifts," I said. "It is only a letter. You can read it first, and you can decide whether she ever sees it." The page contained no promises about trips, houses, or everything he could buy to replace lost time. He introduced himself, admitted that he had not fought hard enough to find the truth, and told Ivy she owed him no name, answer, or affection. He ended by promising that he would not appear without permission again. I gave the letter to Ivy when we reached the manager's office. She read it twice, then asked for a pen. She wrote one sentence beneath Gideon's signature. "Do you keep your promises?" Gideon read her question and answered on the same page. "You do not have to trust my words. You can watch what I do next." Ivy folded the letter and placed it beside the silver rescuing pin in her small purse. My phone rang as we entered the parking lot. Rebecca had received formal notice from the State Laboratory Licensing Board. Because Bianca was now responsible for compliance across several facilities, her attempt to interfere with an old record could not be treated as a family matter or an isolated employee violation. The board was opening an official investigation into Bianca and every protected record she had accessed. The settlement offer arrived 3 days after the licensing board opened its investigation. Rebecca called while I was repairing the broken leg of an antique dining chair. She asked whether Ivy was within hearing distance before reading it aloud. Bianca would acknowledge that the original paternity report contained an administrative error. She would issue a private apology, reimburse my legal expenses, and cooperate in correcting Ivy's records. In return, I would decline to testify publicly, avoid discussing Bianca's conduct with the press, and agree that the matter had been resolved within the family. The document never used the words altered sample, forged signature, or deleted evidence. It described 8 years of deception as an error in paperwork. I set down my chisel. She wants me to help her rename what she did. Rebecca said the offer was designed to reduce Bianca's professional and criminal exposure. Accepting it might shorten the process and protect Ivy from public attention, but it could also limit what regulators were able to establish through my testimony. "I will send you the full document," she said. "Do not decide today." My mother called less than an hour later, which told me Bianca's attorney had already explained the offer to her. Colleen did not ask how Ivy was sleeping or whether she had returned to school. She began by saying the agreement was the only sensible way to stop the family from suffering further. "Bianca will apologize," she said. "Your legal bills will be paid, Ivy's records will be corrected, and everyone can begin again." "Begin what again?" "Our family." "You mean pretending nothing happened?" "I mean protecting Ivy from more ugliness. She does not need to sit through hearings and listen to strangers discuss her blood samples." "She will not be attending the hearing." "Then why keep this going?" "Because the truth had already been hidden once for the sake of keeping everything calm. Because my mother still believed peace meant preventing consequences rather than preventing harm." "You are asking me to preserve the same silence that allowed this to continue for 8 years. I said. "I am asking you to think like a mother." "I am. That is why I will not teach Ivy that people can steal part of her life, call it a mistake, and purchase her silence afterward." Colleen's voice sharpened. "Bianca could lose her entire career. That is a consequence of what she did with it. She was young when this started. She was not young when she deleted Gideon's retesting request 6 years later. She was not young when she tried to erase the audit record at her wedding." My mother became quiet. She could no longer place every choice inside one frightened night 8 years earlier. That evening, Gideon came to the workshop at the time we had agreed. He parked across the street and waited until I opened the door before approaching. He had asked to see Ivy for 20 minutes with me present. They sat at the work table and assembled a small wooden glider from pieces Ivy had already cut. Gideon did not correct her when one wing sat slightly uneven. He asked whether she wanted help, then waited for her answer. After Ivy went upstairs to wash the glue from her hands, I showed him the settlement offer. He read it once and returned it without telling me what to do. "You have an opinion," I said. "I do. But you are not going to give it." "I will if you ask." I studied him. The Gideon I had known 9 years earlier rushed toward danger because he believed action was always better than waiting. The man standing in my workshop seemed to understand that taking control from me, even with good intentions, would repeat part of the harm already done. "What would you do?" I asked. "I would testify," he said. But I am not raising Ivy, protecting her privacy every day, or carrying the consequences the way you are. If you decide ending this quietly is safest for her, I will respect it. I will not use my name, my attorney, or the press to force another choice onto you." For the first time since the wedding, his answer did not make me feel cornered. "I do not want Ivy turned into a headline," I said. "Then make that a condition. Her face, school, and private records stay protected." The next afternoon, Rebecca arranged a call with Naomi. The licensing board had begun reviewing the access history of other files Bianca had managed. Naomi was careful not to accuse her of anything unsupported. "There is no evidence yet that Bianca altered another family's result," she said. "The broader review is necessary because she attempted to delete an audit entry while already responsible for compliance. Regulators have to determine whether that behavior was isolated or whether other records may be at risk." That distinction mattered. I did not want revenge to turn suspicion into fact. However, I also understood that refusing to testify would leave investigators with records, but less context about how Bianca had used them against a real family. The case was larger than my anger, and larger than her wedding. I asked Ivy to sit with me after dinner. I did not mention criminal charges, licensing rules, or the forged disposal form. I told her Bianca had offered to correct the false report privately if we stopped speaking about how it happened. "Would that make the paper true again?" she asked. "It would correct your record." "Would everyone know Aunt Bianca changed it?" "Only a few people." Ivy considered that while arranging peas into a small circle on her plate. What if she did it to another kid? "We do not know that she did. But people are checking?" "Yes." She looked down at the silver pin beside her placemat. She no longer wore it constantly, but she kept it nearby. "I would not want another kid to think their mom or dad did not want them because someone made the paper wrong." Her words were simple, but they removed the last excuse I had been holding. The next morning, I told Rebecca I would reject the settlement. I would testify at the licensing hearing, but Ivy's identity had to be protected. Her face could not be photographed, her school could not be named, and no private medical details beyond what was necessary could be released. Rebecca said she would request those safeguards immediately. Bianca called me that night from a number I did not recognize. For once, there was no polished voice and no carefully arranged explanation. "Please do not testify," she said. "Mom pushed me into this. She said she would fall apart if you left. I thought I was saving what remained of our family. You had 6 years to stop. I was afraid. Colleen was not standing beside you when Gideon requested another test." Bianca began crying. "You do not understand what it is like to spend years building a career and know one decision could destroy it. I understand what it is like to spend years raising a child under a lie you chose to protect. I am your sister. You remembered that only after the evidence was preserved. She asked me to save her license, her reputation, and the work she had built. She never asked what she could do to repair the harm to Ivy." I ended the call. The following day, Miles formally withdrew the marriage license application and ended the engagement. His statement to investigators was brief. He confirmed that he had seen Bianca log into the laboratory system at the resort and attempt to delete an archived audit entry. He did not insult her or discuss their relationship. He simply recorded what he had witnessed. That left my mother. Rebecca's office prepared an affidavit describing Colleen's role in arranging the false result and sending Gideon away. Signing it could expose her to legal consequences. Refusing could allow Bianca to continue claiming she had acted under pressure without proving who had begun the plan. Colleen came to my workshop after closing time. Rebecca had instructed me not to discuss the facts with her without counsel present, so we sat on opposite sides of the work table with the unsigned affidavit between us. My mother looked smaller than she had at the wedding. "If I sign this, Bianca will say I destroyed her life," she said. "If you do not sign it, you will be choosing the lie again." She stared at the final page. The pen lay beside her hand, untouched. Then she looked at me and asked the question she should have asked 8 years earlier. "What happens if I finally tell the truth?" I looked at my mother across the work table. If you tell the truth, Bianca may blame you. You may face consequences too. Ivy may still decide she does not want you in her life. Telling the truth does not erase what happened. Colleen stared at the unsigned affidavit. Then what does it change? It stops the lie from receiving one more day of protection. She left without signing. The licensing hearing began the following Monday in a plain state office building. There were no cameras in the room and no crowd waiting for a dramatic confrontation. Rebecca had arranged for Ivy's name to be shortened to her initials in the public record. Elise stayed with her at my workshop while I testified. Just before the doors opened, Colleen entered the waiting area. She carried the affidavit in a sealed envelope. "I signed it in front of my attorney," she said. I opened the first page. "I am the person who asked my daughter Bianca Keene to falsify the paternity test belonging to Mara Keene and Gideon Shaw." My mother's hand trembled, but I did not embrace her. I gave the statement to Rebecca. "Thank you for telling the truth," I said. "That is not the same as forgiveness." Colleen nodded, as though she had expected nothing more. The hearing panel kept the process simple enough to follow. Naomi went first. She displayed the original access log and explained that Bianca's password and employee badge had been used to print a replacement label at 2:13 inches the morning. 6 years later, the same account opened Gideon's retesting request and deleted it. On the wedding day, Bianca logged in again and attempted to remove the archived audit entry. A handwriting examiner then compared the sample destruction form with documents I had signed over many years. She pointed out the careful first strokes, the unnatural pressure, and several letter shapes that did not match my normal writing. Her conclusion was direct. I had not signed the form. Miles testified by video. He described seeing Bianca seated at the laptop in the bridal suite with Ivy's file open and the delete command on the screen. He did not discuss the failed wedding or insult the woman he had planned to marry. He simply said what he had witnessed. When my turn came, Rebecca asked what the false result had taken from us. I had prepared notes, but I did not read them. "It did not only place the wrong name on a report," I said. "It took 8 years in which my daughter was denied the right to know her father. It took 8 years in which Gideon was denied the chance to prove whether he could remain in her life. It taught me to answer my child's questions with a story that other people had manufactured." One panel member asked whether a corrected record could repair that damage. "It can return the truth," I said. "It cannot return time." Bianca's attorney argued that Colleen had pressured a grieving young employee who believed she was protecting her family. Bianca repeated that she had acted during an emotional crisis and had spent years regretting one terrible decision. The chair of the panel placed 3 dates on the screen. The night Bianca changed the label. The day she deleted Gideon's request 6 years later. The wedding day, when she attempted to erase the audit trail. "No one was standing beside you at all 3 moments," the chair said. "Each date offered a new opportunity to correct the record. Each time, you chose to protect the deception." Bianca turned toward our mother. "You told me Mara would leave and never come back." Colleen opened her signed statement and read it aloud. She admitted that she had been afraid of losing me after my father died. She had treated my choice to move as an attack on her and had convinced Bianca that separating Gideon from the baby would keep our family intact. "I called it protection because I did not want to call it control," she said. "I was willing to make my daughter lonely so that I would not have to be alone." The statement mattered, but it did not make me trust her again. When the panel asked what contact I wanted between Colleen and Ivy, I answered without anger. "None for now. Any future contact must be recommended by a family professional and chosen by Ivy when she is old enough and feels safe. My mother does not receive access to my child as a reward for finally admitting what she did." The panel issued its professional findings that afternoon. Bianca was removed from her compliance position. Her certification to manage protected laboratory records was revoked, and she was barred from working with medical data for a long period determined by the board. The findings were also referred to prosecutors. The criminal case ended several weeks later through guilty pleas. Bianca admitted to record tampering, forgery, and attempted destruction of protected evidence. The judge imposed a period of incarceration followed by supervised release. The exact number of months mattered less to me than hearing the court say clearly that her actions had not been a family misunderstanding. Colleen received supervised probation for her role in arranging the original deception and helping send Gideon away. She was required to complete counseling and obey a no-contact order covering both Ivy and me. Bianca blamed her for the loss of her career. Colleen blamed Bianca for continuing the lie after the first night. The alliance they had called family broke the moment it could no longer protect either of them. Miles had already ended the engagement and withdrawn the marriage license application. His decision appeared in the record only because his testimony explained what happened at the resort. Bianca losing a husband was not the real judgment. The real judgment was that her title, her family, and her polished explanations could no longer shield the truth. Outside the hearing room, Gideon asked to speak with me. "I am not filing for custody," he said. "Not now. I want supervised visits, family counseling, and whatever pace Ivy's therapist believes is safe. You have legal rights. I also have 8 years of absence to answer for. I do not want to win access before I earn trust." I studied him for a moment. He had attended every meeting on time, answered Ivy's letters without making promises he could not guarantee, and accepted every boundary I set. None of that erased the past, but it showed me what he intended to do with the future. "Ivy's school has a model aircraft exhibition Friday night," I said. "You may attend." His face changed, but he kept his voice calm. "Thank you. It is one ordinary evening. No helicopter, no reporters, and no dramatic announcement. You arrive as a guest, and you let her decide how much help she wants." "I understand. And Gideon, do not promise her you will be there, unless you are certain." "I will be there." On Thursday evening, Ivy placed her wooden rescue helicopter on the kitchen table. One rotor kept catching against the housing. She adjusted it twice, then looked toward the dark window. I told her Gideon had been invited to the exhibition. She pressed the silver rescue wing pin into the corner of the display board. "What if he does not come?" I wanted to tell her he would. I wanted to make certainty for her after so many adults had built her life around false assurances. Instead, I sat beside her. "Then we will know he was not ready to keep the promise." Before she could answer, the doorbell rang at exactly 7 o'clock. I opened the door at exactly 7 o'clock. Gideon stood on the porch wearing jeans, a plain brown jacket, and work boots. An old blue pickup was parked behind him. There was no helicopter, security team, or expensive gift. He carried only a small metal toolbox. "Ivy wrote that the rotor was catching," he said. "I brought a few tools in case she wants help." I looked past him at the truck. "I expected you to come tomorrow for the exhibition. I thought arriving tonight might give her time to test the model before she presents it. I can leave if that was not clear." He waited on the porch instead of assuming he could enter. Ivy appeared behind me and saw the toolbox. "You came to fix it?" "I came to help you fix it, but only if you want me to." She considered him for a moment, then opened the door wider. At the kitchen table, Gideon did not take the wooden helicopter from her hands. He asked her to show him where the rotor caught. Ivy turned it slowly, until one blade scraped the housing. "I think I cut the opening too narrow," she said. "That is possible. What would you like to try first?" She chose a small file from his toolbox. Gideon showed her how to hold it, then moved his hands away. When she removed too much wood from one side, he did not correct the mistake for her. He asked what she noticed when she tested the rotor again. "It leans now. What could balance it?" I watched them work beneath the kitchen light. Gideon could have repaired the model in minutes, but he allowed Ivy to discover the solution herself. He offered information when she asked, and remained quiet when she wanted to concentrate. By the time the rotor spun freely, Ivy's nervousness had faded. "Will you still come tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes. What if there is an emergency?" "I am not on call tomorrow night. Elise also has the school address and your mother's number. I have made the arrangements I need to be there. I met his eyes. He had not promised that nothing could ever go wrong. He had simply prepared not to let something preventable become another absence. The following evening, Gideon arrived at the school 10 minutes early. He sat beside me in the second row, while Ivy carried her model to the display table. A parent near the aisle recognized him from television. "Commander Shaw, could we get a photograph after the presentation?" Gideon smiled politely. "Thank you. But tonight belongs to the students. I am only here for Ivy." He did not look around to see whether anyone had heard him. He returned his attention to the stage. Ivy demonstrated the turning rotor and explained how rescue pilots used visibility, balance, and patience when approaching dangerous terrain. She stumbled over one sentence, looked toward us, and continued without asking me to rescue her. Afterward, Gideon waited until she invited him to examine the display. He did not introduce himself as her father. He let Ivy decide what to say when her teacher asked who he was. "This is Gideon," she replied. "He knows about rescue helicopters." It was not the answer he might have wanted, but he accepted it with a smile. That first exhibition did not repair our family. It gave Gideon one ordinary evening in which he did what he had promised. Over the next several months, those evenings began to accumulate. He called Ivy every Tuesday at 7. If work required him to travel, he told us before he left, and called from wherever he was. He answered every letter she wrote, even when she asked difficult questions about why he had stopped searching. He attended family counseling and listened when Ivy said the helicopter at Bianca's wedding had frightened her. After that, he never arrived unexpectedly again. He came to a school music program and sat near the back so no one would notice him. He watched one of Ivy's soccer games in the rain without bringing a camera crew or telling anyone who he was. When she missed the ball that could have tied the game, he did not offer advice. He told her he had enjoyed watching her play. Gideon and I did not pretend our former love had survived unchanged beneath the lies. We were honest about the anger between us. I told him there were still mornings when I remembered his signature on the document giving up his claim and felt as though he had abandoned us all over again. He told me he sometimes looked at Ivy and could barely accept how much of her childhood he had surrendered because he was afraid of another rejection. We began with the truth, not romance. He did not ask to move into my home, and I did not promise we would become a couple again. We learned how to speak without allowing our old hurt to make decisions for Ivy. Whether anything more would grow from that was something time would decide. Bianca began serving her sentence and was prohibited from contacting Ivy. Letters arrived through her attorney, but I returned them unopened. She no longer had the right to use the word family as a path around the court's order. Colleen sent one apology through Rebecca. She admitted that she had confused being needed with being loved and had punished me for choosing a life beyond her control. I placed the letter in a locked file. I would not answer it on Ivy's behalf. When my daughter was older and felt safe enough to decide, the choice would belong to her. Ivy continued improving her wooden helicopter. She replaced the original rotor, adjusted the landing supports, and repainted one side after deciding the first color was too dark. Several months after the first school event, she entered the completed model in a district exhibition. Her teacher asked her to give it a name for the display card. Ivy wrote "Second Flight." "Why did you choose that?" I asked. She ran one finger along the silver rescue wing pin attached beside the cockpit. "Because the first flight still happened," she said. "You cannot pretend it did not, but you can fix what went wrong and try to fly again." Gideon looked down for a moment before telling her it was a good name. After the exhibition, we walked together into the school parking lot. Gideon carried the model because Ivy had finally trusted him with it, but he held it as carefully as if she might ask for it back at any moment. "There is another exhibition in the spring," he said. "Would you like me to come?" Ivy pulled on her coat. "You can come if you are not late. I will be there." I looked at him. "Do not promise something unless you know you can keep it." He nodded. "Then I will make sure I can." At his truck, he placed the model safely inside a padded box and returned it to Ivy. He said goodnight to her, then to me, without stretching the moment into something larger than it was. He had opened the driver's door when Ivy called after him. "Dad." Gideon stopped. There was no music, no crowd, and no helicopter beating the air above us. Only 3 people standing beneath the parking lot lights, carrying the truth of what had been taken and the uncertainty of what might still be rebuilt. Ivy held out the model. "You forgot the toolbox inside it." Gideon returned and took the small box from her. His eyes were wet, but he did not ask her to repeat the word. "Thank you," he said. Ivy slipped her hand into mine as we watched him walk back to the truck. The lies had ended in a courtroom, but our family did not begin there. It began in ordinary moments, with promises kept quietly and a little girl deciding for herself who had earned the right to stay.